Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well. As we all know, Baldur's Gate 3 is one of those rare games that feels almost universally loved. It shattered player expectations, revitalized the CRPG genre, and has one of the most passionate fan bases I've ever seen. But of course, with any game this big and this complex, there are always going to be differing opinions among the community, some of which you might agree with yourself. Well, today I wanted to go through some of the hottest takes I received from a community post I did here on YouTube and a post on Reddit. Now, of course, I know a lot of you may differ when it comes to certain takes in this video, and that's perfectly fine, and I'd love to hear your thoughts and your own hot takes down below. Also, quickly, if you enjoy this type of content, please consider subbing to the channel and dropping a like, and without further ado, let's get right into it. Starting off strong, our first hot take is from 1V and Reed, who says Halsin had no purpose or any relevant commentary after Act 2 and shouldn't have been a permanent companion. Now, if you've seen any of my videos before, I think you already know what I have to say about this take. I'm honestly just not a big fan of Halsin's character. Halsin initially feels like a character who's incredibly important, especially during the earlier moments in Act 1, and in Act 2 he still retains some importance through his quest for Thaniel. And although he didn't officially join until after the conclusion of his personal quest, I still found his story quite compelling, especially in regard to his connection with Thaniel. At this point I was open to his character growing more and bringing his own sense of emotional weight into the story. But as many of you may have also noticed, once Act 2 ends, so does Halsin's story as a whole. Once you reach the city of Baldur's Gate in Act 3, the game shifts all attention away from Halsin and onto pretty much only the 6 origin companions, such as Larian, Lae'zel, and Shadowheart. Halsin has no other motivations or quest lines beyond his relatively short quest in Act 2, and he doesn't really serve any greater role within the story. His emotional journey is wrapped up by the end of Act 2, and with that, so is any sense of further character development. As I've stated time and time again, I do find this really disappointing, and some content I've discussed in prior videos highlights just how good Halsin could have been. And so yeah, I agree with this take, and I think it would have been better off if Halsin was just a major NPC in Act 1 and Act 2, rather than having a permanent place among your party. Now, I'm not too sure if this one is more a hot take or just a frustration with the game's mechanics. This comes from Yadabla, who says, I hate this system where I can check every barrel and box for rotting food, dirty clothes. There's no point. This one is definitely one of the most intriguing ones on this list, and come to think of it, I do definitely agree with this. It's obvious as you're exploring the expansive world of Faerun that in every cave, room, and house, there are countless barrels, crates, wardrobes, or just little boxes to open up. And if you're a bit of a loot goblin like me, you'll be looting up everything that you see. Now, while having all this scattered around the game's areas is great for building a world that feels lived in through all of these small environmental details, they don't really mean anything. The more you play the game, the more searching every container feels like more constant background noise rather than actually rewarding exploration. But of course, in the process of doing all of this, you'll find plenty of items, secret chests, and loot tied to certain quests or locations. But again, the sheer volume of these filler containers makes it frankly annoying to get to those certain moments where you find actual use for loot. And it's not at all that I dislike looting, but it's the fact that in Baldur's Gate 3, 99% of the items you collect have no utility at all. The game has no real crafting system other than its really basic alchemy system, and so a majority of the loot you find ends up just being junk that fills up your inventory. So while I get why the system exists, I still think that the game would have benefited from fewer but more meaningful containers, rather than dozens that just leave you hauling around a moldy carrot and a random plate. This is one of those takes I completely understand on the surface, but personally don't really agree with. This take is from No Longer OP, who says, the Voiceless Protagonist makes it hard to commit to a playthrough and makes the main character's relationship to the companions seem non-existent. Of course, in Baldur's Gate 3, you play as a mostly silent protagonist, which is something I'm guessing a lot of modern RPG players aren't really used to anymore. Games today tend to definitely lean heavily into fully voiced protagonists, cinematic camera angles, and very sort of authored dialogue performances. So it makes sense that a lot of people look at Baldur's Gate 3's lack of a voiced protagonist and find it hard to connect or feel immersed in the story. But for me, one of the strengths of Baldur's Gate 3 is actually the fact that the protagonist is silent. Baldur's Gate 3 is of course a game built around giving you an enormous amount of freedom in shaping your character's personality, backstory, and their general approach to the world around them. And I definitely think because of that, having a fully voiced protagonist could push you toward a more specific tone for your character, rather than it fully aligning with what you're role playing. Also, in terms of this making it harder harder for us to connect to the companions, I also completely disagree. The game lets you make your own choices and reactions, and this definitely helps establish the feeling that this is your character, rather than someone you're just leading along. To me, the game's dialogue lines are incredibly expressive, and the conversations you have with your fellow companions still greatly highlight the emotional depth of the game. The companions are ultimately the heart of this game, and your character is more of a blank slate you shape in order to experience their incredible stories and quests. So again, while I can kind of understand why some people might see the Voiceless Protagonist as a weakness, I personally feel like it fits the structure and roleplay flexibility of Baldur's Gate 3 almost perfectly. Okay, this take is from Jedi Master Briscoe Mutt, who says most of the big fights aren't that difficult, even on honor mode, even without cheese strategies. While I can't exactly comment on the honor mode of this take, as I have not done a run on this difficulty, I can still discuss the difficulty of the game's biggest fights. While I think early on some of the game's biggest fights, such as the raid on the Grove, are mildly difficult, I actually do agree with the idea that most of the major fights in the game aren't really all too difficult. This definitely becomes more of a problem as you get into Act 3, as you begin to master how Baldur's Gate 3 systems work, from its turn economy to high ground advantage and the synergy of your party. Now, that's not to say that all big fights in this game are easy, but once you've gotten a feel for the game's combat system, many of them can be approached in ways that will see you gain a massive advantage before anything even happens. For example, stealthily leading your party into position can give you an absolutely brutal opening to a fight, and oftentimes you'll be able to clear some of the game's largest fights in just a couple of turns. And this is even without cheesing the game through explosive barrels or other tricks, and that's really just because of the fact that you gradually begin to master the game's combat mechanics. I think a lot of the perceived difficulty comes from players who approach Baldur's Gate 3 like a traditional RPG in terms of combat, just swinging and praying. But the real complexity and mastery of the game's combat of course comes in the way of approaching every major fight as a sort of puzzle rather than simply an obstacle. I think it's for this very reason why some of the game's most significant fights, like the fight against Orin and Gortash, can simply be done in just a couple of turns. Overall, while I do think the game does have some standout challenges like Raphael in the final battle, the game's fights are generally pretty forgiving, especially on subsequent playthroughs. Act 2 is of course one of the game's most atmospheric parts, and I think a lot of people walk into the Shadow Coast lands expecting a bit more danger. Well, this is something shared by Romo Gotti, who says Act 2 I felt like should have been a mad dash to safety. The way the Shadowlands are talked about during the entirety of Act 1 makes them seem much more dangerous than in the game. Now, I'm not entirely sure if this is exactly a hot take, but I think Act 2 already does this in more ways than one. The moment you first step into the curse, the world around you completely shifts, with everything showing this sense of eeriness and dread. Between the fact that the area has some twisted wildlife and the constant threat of moving too far from a light source, I definitely think there's already a lot of those sort of horror elements. But I can also understand why some people wish Larian delved into this tone a bit further, maybe making it more like a relentless gauntlet where the curse is constantly closing in on you. At the same time, I do think Act 2 already feels dangerous enough. The looming danger of Moonrise Towers, the journey into Shah's Temple, for me it all carries a sort of dread that I don't think the other two acts do quite as well. Act 2 definitely feels more intense, and the atmospheric storytelling of Ketheric Thorm's grief and suffering is absolutely incredible. Act 2 has fantastic moments of tension and mystery, and for me it already feels very much like a dash to safety through your journey of restoring the land to what it once was. Ultimately, although I can understand the sentiment, to me Act 2 already leans heavily into that feeling of a looming and ever dangerous threat, no matter where you go. This is a take I've actually seen quite a few times before, and I'm kind of mixed on it. This comes from Kylan1235, who says Baldur's Gate 3 needed more evil/morally grey companions. As we all know, Baldur's Gate 3 is a game full of choice, especially in the way that you morally shape your entire journey. So when most of the companions lead toward a sort of good or at least redeemable path, I can understand how some people might say that the game lacks evil or morally grey companions. If you're doing an evil run, only a handful of companions actually align with that sort of vibe. Of course, a companion like Minthara obviously fits the evil route, and Astarion has a genuinely grey, sometimes selfish perspective, but outside of these two, most of the party members end up being more heroic than anything else. However, at the same time, I don't think the cast is at all lacking depth or complexity. A lot of Baldur's Gate 3's companions are in fact morally conflicted, but just not in an overtly evil way. Lae'zel starts the game fiercely loyal to Vlaakith, Shadowheart struggles with faith and identity, and even Will and Karlach, who are definitely more heroic, have personal compromises tied to devils and survival. The writing definitely gives all of the companions a sort of inner darkness, but it's just not the type of darkness that encourages anyone to lean into a fully evil playthrough. So while I get the desire for more varied moral lineup of companions, I also think the cast is rich enough as is to still have a morally complex range of characters. However, I definitely think that having just one or two more morally grey or purely evil companions definitely could have rounded out the spectrum a little more. Now, this is definitely one of the more spicy takes on this list, and for me again, it lands somewhere in the middle. This take comes from Zealous Ideal Fee 927, who says the game was unfinished at launch and unfairly got a pass. On the one hand, I understand why people might have this sentiment, as the game wasn't exactly technically polished when it first came out. In particular, Act 3 had noticeable performance issues for a lot of players, and there were many quests and endings that felt a little bit underbaked or abrupt. Of course, as time went on, later patches introduced an epilogue, many more endings, and large fixes to the game's technical performance. So I can get why looking back for some feels like Baldur's Gate 3 got a free pass, simply because everything else in this package was just so extraordinary. But now, on the other hand, calling the game unfinished at launch to me oversimplifies what Larian actually delivered on day one. Even at launch, Baldur's Gate 3 was by far one of the most complete, ambitious RPGs that we've seen in years. The sheer volume of the game's content, the depth of its companion arcs, the branching choices, and the interconnected systems were all at a level most other developers have never come close to achieving. So again, while I can get around to the idea that some rough edges definitely existed, especially in the game's final stretch, to me the core experience was still so incredibly polished. And when you consider the magnitude of the game's narrative and the amount of variables at play, it's not surprising in any way that certain things needed fixes and refinements after launch. Overall, I don't think the game launched in an unfinished state, and while it definitely needed updates to smooth out performance and add some endings and polish, I still think the launch version deserved the praise it received. Okay, this take is from Captain Carrot, who says Act 3 is amazing and people need to understand that you can choose what paths you want. There is no need to do them all. Now, I know it's turning into a bit of a running theme here, but again, I honestly find myself somewhere in the middle with this. I've spoken about my grievances with Act 3 multiple times before, and even have a video dedicated to its various shortfalls. Act 3 definitely has much to critique, from the bloat of the content to the loss of reactivity to even the difficulty. Act 3 definitely has quite a few problems, but at the same time, I do agree that a lot of the negativity, even I have with Act 3, comes from the way I engage it rather than the content itself. Baldur's Gate 3 will always be a game about choice, and Act 3 is arguably the climax of that philosophy. You're not supposed to do everything in the city in one hit, and the game deliberately throws tons of overlapping storylines and quests your way, which can often make you feel overwhelmed. But when you let go of the need to do everything, Act 3 is much more of a satisfying experience. Playing it this way definitely gives me a greater appreciation for just how much freedom the game gives you, and the charm of the lower city is absolutely undeniable. So while I understand why it overwhelms people, I also think Act 3 has the ability to shine when you approach it with the mindset of doing what you want instead of treating it like a checklist. It's definitely not perfect, and I do think it has many shortcomings that just aren't present in prior acts, but there is a great abundance of content there if you don't force yourself to consume it all at once. The diversity of the companion roster is another topic I've discussed in a prior video. This is from FWSC50, who says the diversity of companions is lacking. We have multiple elf/half-elves, humans, one tiefling, and one gith, while there are so many other races to have. Okay, I honestly do agree with this take, and I think a lot of you will feel the same once you take a step back and look at the game's full companion roster. I don't think anyone can deny that Baldur's Gate 3 has an incredible cast of characters, both in terms of writing and personality, but when you break it down by race, there's definitely an imbalance. There's not much variation between the aesthetic of many of the game's companions, from Shadowheart to Astarion to Gale to Will, and I understand the sentiment of the party feeling a little samey, especially when you compare it to the wild variety of gnomes, dragonborns, and other races you see throughout your journey in Faerun. What definitely stands out to me is how few of the game's companions represent the more diverse fantasy races that exist in the game's world. Of course, we've got our Githyanki, our Drow, and Tiefling, but even then, they're all of a similar height and build, and very much fit into the same archetype of the rest of the game's companions in terms of their aesthetic. For a setting as rich as Faerun, I definitely found it strange that we don't even get one halfling or dragonborn companion, and especially in terms of the game's world building, it feels like a big missed opportunity. Now, of course, this doesn't make the game's existing companions any less compelling, but I do think that the roster could have greatly benefited from just one or two more visually and culturally distinct races. It for sure would have added another dimension to the game's party composition, and would have made the world feel much more diverse. Alright, I'm not exactly too sure whether this is a hot take at all, more so just an interesting one. This one is from Sudden Deepak, who says, Minthara should have been the main character, evil minion turning on her group to save the world and become the hero she never knew she could be. Okay, first it's obvious to us all that Minthara is definitely one of the more unique companions in all of Baldur's Gate 3. When you first meet her, she's completely aligned with the cult of the Absolute, and oh is she brutal. And because of that, I can definitely see how some may look at her and think what if she was the protagonist instead of a companion. companion. Of course, I think we can all agree that there's something inherently compelling about a character who starts deep on the evil side of the spectrum and then builds an entire story towards redemption or further corruption. But at the same time, I'm not too sure that Minthara fits this role, especially in the way that the game is structured and who Minthara at the end of the day is. If there is any character I personally believe could have been the main character, it's definitely Will. Will's arc works a lot better when you play as him, and I don't think this would apply equally to Minthara, especially the version we have in the game. Sure, she'd be great as a lens for exploring the darker paths of the game, but I don't think she'd necessarily work as our window into this world. Still, I do get the appeal of this idea. There's something honestly fascinating about imagining a version of Baldur's Gate 3 where the protagonist begins embedded in the cult and then either descends deeper or rebels against everything they were poised to believe. It's not something I personally think the game would have at all benefited from, but it's a fun thought experiment for sure, and one I think could have been intriguing given the complexity of Minthara's character. This is a take I don't think I can honestly get behind at all. Alright, first this take is from Diarrhea, who says I could not care less about any companion that isn't Lae'zel or Halsin. I don't really understand this take, especially because I believe that Baldur's Gate 3 is inherently built on the strength of its entire companion cast. I get that people definitely form attachments to specific characters, and while I get that in respect to Lae'zel, I don't really get the connection to Halsin all too much. To me, saying that every companion is forgettable or not worth caring about is just kind of crazy, to be honest. One of the biggest achievements of Baldur's Gate 3 is how varied, layered, and human its companions can often feel. Shadowheart's struggle with identity and faith is one of the core emotional cores of the game, and Astarian's journey from control to actual agency has resonated with a large number of us for a reason. I think the reason that Baldur's Gate 3's companions work so well is because they all in some way represent different philosophies, traumas, and worldviews. All of these characters have arcs full of charm, tragedy, and self-discovery that adds to the weight of the overall narrative. And you're not supposed to love everyone equally, but each companion undeniably contributes something distinct to the story, whether it's emotional depth or moral conflict. Even the companions that you see yourself not really journeying with still shape the world through their own quests and decisions. So while I can kind of understand loving just two companions from the game's wide cast, I think reducing the rest of the cast to not worth caring about ignores just how much heart and nuance the game pours into every single one of them. I know I might get flamed for my opinion on this one, but just hear me out first. Okay, this take is from Swoos Boost, who says, I don't really care for Minthara as a companion, even on an evil playthrough. I kind of unfortunately do agree with this one in a lot of ways, even though I don't think Minthara is a bad character. Minthara is introduced with so much intensity and presence in Act 1, but once you finally get to recruit her near the end of Act 2, her presence and character kind of halt entirely. It doesn't help that she's one of very few companions who doesn't even have her own companion quest, and this is especially unfortunate due to the complexity of her character. Her late arrival into the game's story also means that she misses a lot of the relationship building moments that define the game's strongest character arcs, and her lack of content definitely doesn't help at all. Although patches may add a little more dialogue and presence for a character, she still feels extremely thin when compared to characters like Shadowheart and Astarian, whose arcs span the entire game. And even if you decide to take an evil route, her lack of development means that despite the potential for the exploration of her ideologies and mentality, she instead seems mostly one note. So again, while I don't think Minthara is necessarily a weak character, I definitely do think that she was done dirty in terms of her content, and a lack of companion quests especially hurts her chances of being any more than the one drow in your roster. While I can definitely see the appeal in her character, she's also underdeveloped in too many ways that make it much harder for players such as myself to truly click with her, even on an evil playthrough. I had to put this one in the video because it's honestly funny but also weirdly understandable. The take is from May042, who says, I wish they'd stop patching the game. Every tiny little hotfix breaks mods, and it's really annoying when modding the game is already pretty finicky to begin with. Okay, if any of you have ever modded the game before, you'll know the exact pain that's being talked about here. A new patch or hotfix drops, and suddenly half your load order just explodes. The script extender needs to be updated, some mods you were running in a current playthrough are not updated, and it's all just a bit of a mess. So I completely understand where this sentiment comes from, especially when running a heavily modded playthrough. But at the same time, I don't think it makes sense to want Larian to stop patching the game. Of course, as we all know, the game's major content patches are all done with, but even in spite of that, the game is massive and new problems and bugs still pop up to this day. We absolutely need patches to resolve bugs and ensure that the game continues to stay polished and stable moving forward. And while I can see the pain of this for modders especially, the modding community of Baldur's Gate 3 has consistently proven itself to be incredibly talented talented and dedicated. It's honestly just part of modding such a massive game, and while the frustration is valid, to me it's no excuse to freeze the game in place. The plain reality is that patching a game as big as Baldur's Gate 3 is still going to be necessary for a while, and while I genuinely do sympathize with players who want their games to always stay stable, I still think that the game's ongoing patches and hotfixes do far more good than harm. And that wraps up some of the hottest Baldur's Gate 3 takes that I came across. Whether you agreed with a few or disagreed with all of them, that's just really the beauty of a game as massive as Baldur's Gate 3. I'd honestly love to hear all of your own thoughts down below, and if you want to see another part to this, feel free to drop all of your hot takes as I'd love to cover them sometime in the future. Anyway, that's all from me for today's video. If you enjoyed, please consider subbing to the channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 and RPG content, and I'll see you all in the next one. Peace.